What if the people that we care about and love worked in our factories? Would we want them to work there? What if we lived in the communities where our factories operated? Would we drink the water? Do we eat the food? Will we have pride in saying, I'm associated with this partner, with this company? And if the answer is no, then we haven't done everything that we can.
Welcome to the Regeneration Will Be Funded. I'm your host, Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're having conversations about regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. How can we build an economy that's in service to life? Brought to you by Ma Earth. You can find all of our conversations at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Today's guest is Ephi Banaynal dela Cruz. She is the co-founder and CEO of Context Nature. Ephi has held executive sustainability roles at Microsoft, SAP, and Palm Inc., where she's been building action, accountability, and reporting systems. Now we're seeing important new regulations happen, especially in Europe, that require companies do more to report on and ensure sustainability in their supply chains. Ephi is using her knowledge and experience in these arenas to build new tools at Context Nature. Let's dive right into the discussion with Ephi Banaynal dela Cruz. Today we are here with Ephi Banaynal dela Cruz. She is the co-founder and CEO of Context Nature. Thank you so much, Ephi, for being here.
Thank you, Matthew. It's such a pleasure.
We're here at New York Climate Week. Mm-hmm. I understand you just made time for us after hanging out with Al Gore. How's it going?
No, it's been just an amazing week. My co-founder and our CXO, Sylvia Baquer, and I just came from DC, Washington, DC, where we met with one of our dear partners, the Earth Law Center, and attended their symposium on Earth Law, and then continued on our journey to Climate Week here in New York City. It's been, what is it now, Thursday, right? It's been an amazing 4 days so far. We got to pitch in a climate AI competition, which is our first time pitching live. It's been fantastic. But Al Gore, definitely meeting the vice president this morning. After 13 years of chatting with him, it was good to bump it. I think it's a sign, right? It's a sign that now more than ever, we have to work together and figure out the path forward. It's a matter of survival, right? And I have 2 kids myself. And both my boys, I've said from the very beginning, if I was going to be away from them, I have to continue to do something that I can say, Mom did something today for you, right? For the future.
And you've been to a lot of climate events and symposiums, I imagine, over the years. How is the tone that you're finding here? Is it similar to the way it's always been? Is it shifting? What's the mood?
I think I've entered it in so many different avenues, right? Climate, certainly, but I was mostly in conversations around supply chain and human rights. So I've been one of those who's trying to been making those connections between the two. And I think this time around, that connection is more apparent. And that really encourages me. The mood is more positive and energetic, but there's still a lot of the same sentiment, like how do we, create this economy that can create more money at the same time. So a little bit of that gives me some pause, because there's still a lot of education to be done. But again, you always want to lead with hope, and optimism. And I certainly got a lot of that from the people that we met. So
Nice.
It's about who you hang out with.
Yes, yes. And there's so many different, there's a kaleidoscope of people and opportunities and a full spectrum of contexts here. So before we dive into Context Nature, I'd love to hear more about your background. What were you doing before this?
So thanks for that question. Maybe I'll start with how I got into the U.S. first of all. So I was born and raised in the Philippines. And when I was in college, I focused a lot on, aside from getting my degree, to do socio-political activism. And one of the ways we expressed that was through the arts and theater. So I witnessed firsthand some of the things that, just happens around you. You live in such privileged situations. Even as a scholar, I had those benefits. And, this is something where I have to try to contribute in any way that I can. And I got the opportunity to get a U.S. scholarship grant to come to the U.S. and pursue a master's degree, which now we could call like a sustainability degree. It didn't exist at that time. So I kind of put that together, political science, business, and environmental science. And I got my first job in Silicon Valley as a quality engineer, but I did ask that I wanted to do an environmental management system, ISO 14000, if I were to take that role. And I think that really got me started. Understanding how businesses worked, especially in the, through the lens of supply chain and manufacturing. And it just struck me how much opportunity to embed thinking about the environment and social justice in that type of work, but it's not common language. It manifests in different ways, but people just won't use the same terminologies. So I learned back then that I had to learn different languages, right? The language of business, of manufacturing, and also really how to hone skills of getting people together and organized. Not having an engineering degree certainly made it very difficult for me to initially penetrate a lot of those conversations. But I think the humility that one can bring and just say, I want to learn and gather people together really worked well for me. So that helped with collective action overall. And I was able to do amazing things with people, especially when after working in manufacturing, I worked at, back then, Palm Inc., Palm Pilot.
Palm Pilots? I do remember. I'm
you
that
do
old.
recall. Okay. So I got the opportunity to be their first environmental steward. And at that time, it was defined as somebody who was going to think beyond compliance, work with the product teams, and eventually that role added working with the facilities, so help them with LEED certification, and then also with education with the employee base itself. But one of the key milestones that I think also helped define my path was getting to work on sustainable packaging and also elimination of harmful materials in the cables. Back then, flammable flame retardants were necessary, but of course in the manufacturing itself and the material, there were detrimental effects. But we knew as a small company, we couldn't get the scale. So once again, collective action came into play, and I got to work with other brands and worked with the suppliers to change how they would test and ultimately think about impacts of the materials that they would use. So thus being able to create the early work on sustainable packaging and removal of harmful chemicals on cables itself. And then really worked at the software company and learn how software, SAP. So I had to stop at SAP to really work at how do we use technology to scale the work that we're doing. So I had the opportunity to work on the sustainable supply chain business case and also the reporting business case. One of the things I'm most proud of there is helping the company think about integrated reporting. So once again, another beginning of a new wave of how you think about your financial impact and performance with sustainability, social, and environmental impact. But then my calling came full circle, working at Microsoft for the last 10 years. And I've had just the opportunity to do amazing work with amazing humans, looking at the lens of how do we create equity and respect human beings. And when people used to ask me what my work was, I would talk about how do we protect life, and go back to, again, the dignity and ethics of people. And they were like, but I thought you ran supply chain and you did compliance. I'm like, yeah, but that's the function.
Mm.
But the work is beyond that. And that meant inspiring people to understand that this was not just something you do because it's what everyone says or what you believe in, but this is real impact.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's really going to work, you have to embed that into the business process. So I remember that day when I had to present to over 200 executives. My manager at that time was saying, stick to the script, read all of these. And I said, no, I heard everything that was discussed. I can't just do that. I need to pull all the threads, figure out what matters to them. So I had the dramatic, turn down the lights, and I came from the back and I started with, what if? What if the people that we care about and love worked in our factories?
Mm.
How would we come up with a strategy and how would we approach the program? Would we want them to work there? What if we lived in the communities where our factories operated or our suppliers did business? Would we drink the water?
Mm-hmm.
Do we eat the food? Will we have pride in saying, I'm associated with this partner, with this company? And if the answer is no, then we haven't done everything that we can. And I know that was like a gamble, but I didn't know how else to start it. Because if I was going to do that work, it mattered to me that we had to connect with the human being. And then we can talk about how to embed that into the business. It worked. That was the beginning of, again, the 10 years that I'll be forever grateful for. And we changed conversations. We were doing policies and standards, thinking about how that affects compensation. How do we create a movement, but grounded in business processes?
Mm-hmm.
How did we get partners to come with us, both for us to be able to inspire, but more importantly, to learn from them? How do we create a community of representatives across, all different sectors gathered together towards the same goal? And at Microsoft, it was a goal of empowerment, enable every organization on the planet to do more. That was just so aligned to what we were trying to do as a supply chain compliance organization. But we spoke a different language. And, it's just been such an amazing experience. And now here, Sylvia and I and all of our partners have this opportunity that we just had to take to bring in everything that we've learned over the years and the people that we've been able to encounter who can be with us and who are going to teach us and mentor us to imagine, again, a different world that we can be very proud of. One that perhaps we can leave the extractive approach behind, and one where we embrace what really nature is teaching us, which is to regenerate. Nothing is wasted, right? It just always keeps coming back. I think we forget that we are nature. I mean, we are one species. So, but I think we've just gotten, maybe counter to that. And of course, we're going to use the language of business. We're going to find the ways to inform businesses through nature data on how to make better decisions. We want to demystify all of these information that's out there, make them understandable and actionable. I think that's really key. And if anything, that whole journey I just described has taught me is we can't do this alone.
Mhm.
We're going to need you. We're going to need everybody. And we're excited to bring about and co-create this hopefully new economy that we can, again, be really proud of.
Mm. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm just imagining you as the first sustainability manager for the Palm Pilot. And, fast forward to now, a couple of weeks ago, watching Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, on the TV commercial, making commitments that we haven't seen in that type of mainstream public way from what Apple is the largest company or second largest company on the planet. Like how does that make you feel, the good and the bad, between the progress being made, the greenwashing, the way that things are being framed? What did you make of that commercial in this moment?
Oh goodness, my first reaction was, wow. And that could go either way, right? Worked in the same industry like Apple was in the hardware space. I can take appreciation in how difficult it is to move this whole ecosystem towards these aspirations. I would have certainly an opinion of how I would have approached that, perhaps differently. But nonetheless, I don't want to discredit the attempt. I think it took bravery to put this out there. And if their goal is to get a reaction, I think they certainly did, from all sides. On one hand, a lot of people would say they're not really thinking about nature from the very beginning, right? That's one camp saying a lot of the commitments or progress that they've expressed doesn't necessarily tie back into perhaps this regenerative consciousness that should be part of those decision-making. On the one hand, these discussions don't occur in the mainstream, like you said.
Right.
So I think, whether you're in one camp or the other, this starts the conversation. And then I think we should embrace what just occurred and think about how can we drive more constructive conversations around this. And, maybe say, Tim, Lisa, perhaps sit down with us at Context Nature and our partners. Maybe let's talk about how to put really nature as a director on your board. How do you have nature as the voice in all parts of your decision making? What would that look like? We're working with, for example, the Earth Law Center to come up with those models to help them from a legal model perspective, but more importantly, how to embed that consciousness. And maybe, again, have this constructive conversation. What could they have done differently in terms of the commitments that they're making? How to recalibrate maybe the programs that they're already doing well to make sure that all of those considerations are up there from the very beginning.
Yeah, we had a great conversation with Grant Wilson from Earth Law Center and covered
That's
some
great.
of these topics, including the notions around nature on the boards of directors. Before I ask you more about Context Nature, I am curious, I think that many of us feel that even when corporations improve their supply chains, maybe use more sustainable packaging, whatever, that it's far too little too late, and that the crisis that we face is so much deeper than that.
Yes.
And that we're still building upon precepts of infinite growth and consumerism and extraction, and having worked inside the belly of the beast, so to speak, some of the largest corporations on the planet, how do you feel the consciousness shift and the progress we're making relative to the context that surrounds us, in terms of life on Earth being threatened?
I think the incentives seem to be not strong enough, right? In a lot of those conversations, there's a lot of confusion. there's a lot of competing priorities. There are definitely emerging leaders or leaders, depending on the criteria you're looking for. I can say that there hasn't been one, in my opinion, that really demonstrates that consciousness that permeates from the bottom up and from the top down, because a lot of the practices are not aligned. A lot of the organizations are not incentivized towards that. It's still looking at growth targets and revenue. For me, that's a key indicator. I think organizations have this massive opportunity to really transform the way we do business. And I think sometimes the financial structures don't really push them far enough. The regulations are starting to. I think there's employee movements that could also push it. But I think we really need to focus on education and organize better. I mean, these conversations that you're doing, I think could be really helpful, but we might need to do more outreach and really get to the heart of it. Like how? How do you really do that?
Right.
And I think we tend to approach it as consciousness and then not really describe the how, like the actual business practices that you need to affect change on. That's what we're trying to do in creating this product. But we are going to need a lot of the experts around the table because we're still in our own bubbles. So, and that's the same for corporations.
Right. And so it seems like one of those practical hows that we need to address is supply chains.
Absolutely.
And,
Absolutely.
Can you paint a picture, especially for those who may not have a nuanced understanding, appreciation of why are supply chains so important? What are some of the key issues that we need to address? What's the kind of relative impact that supply chains have in the global context?
Absolutely. So every supply chain, if we're thinking about a tangible product, will have raw materials. And let's just take electronics as an example. Raw materials, from the mining is extracted. Right? And the opportunity at that stage is to think about ways to not keep taking from the earth. And that's just like a radical concept when you're looking at these finite resources have been designed to take that technical nutrient and put that into the product. A lot of people are affected at that community level where this extraction occurs. And oftentimes the motion of purchasing doesn't really look at any of that impact. It's more about what's the price, what's the quality, can I get it on time? There's conversations, obviously, about environmental impacts now at that stage. There's new standards. I was at the Responsible Mineral Initiative, so I was fortunate enough to serve as chair since 2018. I've seen at the forefront how difficult it is to get consensus, even at that stage in the supply chain, because there's always this tension that occurs in having to find, again, the best price at the quality just in time. And then now, motivated by regulation, you have to think about environmental human rights. But the same individuals who are trying to do that, they have to do the business case for their organizations to get support for that. That's part of the problem.
Right.
You're expelling so much effort to do the business case when the data is clear. You can't just keep taking and taking, but that's the motion. So supply chain, we have the power to say, I'm only going to purchase things that align with your values of protecting the planet and communities. But I know that's difficult when price is a barrier. So I think there's this opportunity to rethink things that we buy, things that we make, and the purchasers themselves to use that power to shift that system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it reminds me of like, I think there's also like a disconnect where we don't trust the packaging and the claims that companies are making. You know, I remember watching my brother get excited about what Tesla was doing for a moment, and then visiting a lithium mine and no longer being, you know, nearly as positive about the EV transformation, with lots of nuance. And I don't want to speak for him, but it hits you at a gut level that, you know, what we're being marketed as clean and green and 100% and all this kind of stuff is a bit of a fairy tale. And it doesn't mean that we still don't need to make these transitions. But we do need to make sure we're not repeating the same extractive mindset of the past as we go about the new tools of the future. So yeah, help me understand, you know, what are you seeing as the gaps between the end purchaser who wants to align with their values, but may have, like myself, skepticism or distrust of what I read on the label about whatever carbon neutral or green intent that the company is selling me?
Yeah. So I think part of what you're describing is the fact that there are all of these claims that are perhaps single attributes, right? So in the case that you just described, carbon neutral, if you look at food and bev, you will have fair trade, organic, right? All of those different labels, it is confusing because those claims do pertain to attributes, right, that demonstrate alignment with the sustainable values. I think that is confusing for the consumer. I was asked a question before, do I see these things converging? And of course, you always say, I hope so.
Right.
But they're not, right? In terms of the regulations that we're seeing, there's still all of the different alphabets. I think an opportunity for a company right now is to look at what outcomes are they trying to achieve, and this doesn't necessarily exist this way. Ultimately, you want healthy soil, healthy air, right? You want protection of biodiversity. You want equity.
Clean water.
Yeah, clean water, less carbon or carbon neutral, like you said, and communicate where you're at across those different attributes so that the consumer understands where that journey is for that organization. And, you know, I'm hopeful that we'll get to that kind of claim, hopefully in the not too far future, but in the near future, to really educate, because there will always be something. But you want to make the best choice for the current state, or definitely you're going to have to change the practices that you have, right? So if it's a vehicle, then maybe, you know, walk or ride or take public transportation, right? I mean, those are always going to be the alternatives. But with everything that we're purchasing, having a more multidimensional view of the impacts, whether that's positive or negative, I think is the new future that we should be heading towards to educate the consumer. And that goes the same for a purchaser, like these organizations in their supply chain too.
Right. So supply chains, I mean, they're so infinitely complex, right? Like, oh my gosh, you have so many different stakeholders, you have different jurisdictions and geographies, different regulations and rules. I imagine it's just a very messy problem around data, reporting. So what are the opportunities that we have now in 2023 to bring more organization to this?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. That's what we're trying to do at Context Nature, partnering with a lot of these data providers to bring this information into the workflow of decision-making for organizations. Because a lot of this data is causing a lot of confusion. A lot of the decision makers don't even know how to think about it. So once they get access to the information, they don't quite understand, what does that mean for my own business,
Right.
for my own context. So what we're trying to do as an organization is create this ecosystem of service providers that can bring and capture this data and present it in a way that guides them through this discovery, this planning, this assessment, to strategy, to programming, to monitoring, and ultimately reporting, and then continuous improvement. So we see this clear opportunity to create a way for people to not say, I don't know what that means, and now I should do something about it.
And so it sounds like what I hear you describing for Context Nature is bringing that data to the fingertips of buyers inside of supply chains, giving them context of how to interpret it, and importantly, taking a multidimensional approach. So it's not just one measurement or one piece of information, but really we have to be thinking from an ecosystemic lens.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, if you imagine a day of a sourcing person right now, the metrics that they have, again, are driven more by cost, quality, and on-time delivery, and maybe some environmental carbon goals, but it can't really think about nature. So if we bring nature information to the forefront of their decision-making, like you said, to their fingertips, imagine how they can see now what are the opportunities and the risks and the impact to nature with such purchase. It could change how they think about it.
Right. And you spoke a bit about the minerals policy, but my understanding is that we have some important shifts happening in Europe around supply chain regulations. Can you share more about what's going on there?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have new regulations right now, for example, in the EU and other jurisdictions, right? Norway and Germany, where they're requiring corporations to report more deeply and more comprehensively regarding risk. So it used to be just one piece of the supply chain, and now you have to look at all considerations. And what I think these regulations are doing is driving this conversation for organizations to no longer just have single attributes, but really look deeply into their supply chains and understand not just where you have direct contracts, but your sub-tiers. And that's really difficult. But it is actually so important and so powerful that we start to understand what's going on in that whole value chain. And now it becomes your responsibility as a brand. You have the accountability to do something about it. And of course, disclose that whole journey. So now companies are being held accountable to impacts that oftentimes are not visible to them. So we're going to see, I believe, more and more regulations become stricter and stricter. And it's going to help the shift occur faster, but perhaps hopefully fast enough for that to occur.
Yeah. I mean, I can understand there are probably legitimate criticisms about how this might make certain companies less competitive because they have more red tape, or it might create an advantage for larger scale companies over small scale companies who can't spend as many resources tracking all of these things. But I think ultimately the direction is clear that we have to create parameters and bounds in which to operate, and we need to create more transparency and visibility. And now it's up to the market to start to bring these solutions into place to say, hey, the procurement departments at all of these companies now demand products for better intelligence to understand their purchasing decisions. And I guess that's squarely where Context Nature fits in. I understand you just did a climate AI contest, and you were one of the finalists. Can you share more about what's happening with that?
Yeah, so we were very much honored to be one of the three, and first time pitching live for us, and it was an amazing experience. Because again, you get to be in this room with other entrepreneurs and investors and talk about what we're trying to do to disrupt, to transform how we currently bring data to the market and how do you help organizations understand it. There was a lot of big words used, everything from nature intelligence, planetary intelligence. We're trying to build a nature intelligence powered by an AI assistant to make data actionable, right? But we're truly working on doing that. And we've had these amazing conversations with people on both sides, challenging us on how to think about this business. There were some questions around, is this really something VCs can invest in because of the return on investment might be different, especially if we're talking about creating a new economic system where it's not just one-off transactions, but ongoing exchange of value and recognition of value within our own ecosystem. But also really encouraged by all of the excitement it generated, because they're like, you're on the edge. You're trying to do something that not a lot of people are saying, like giving nature, being like a co-founder, like 10% of the company, being a public benefit corporation, trying to put nature, as director on our board, and trying to do this in a way where we want to create partnerships that continue to exchange this value long-term, not short-term. So it's been really encouraging and exciting, but I think we also recognize there's still so much work to do.
Yep.
Coming up with exactly what those values and principles are going to be on how we transact the business, how do we exchange that value, how do we incentivize data providers to come with us versus maybe just going on their own directly to customers, figuring out how to build a system that embodies the vision that I just described. It's going to be part of the big challenges up ahead.
Yeah, well, we'll be rooting for you for sure.
Oh,
Can
thank
you
you
share more about how is Nature a shareholder of Context Nature?
So we're in the beginning of that journey, but from the onset, we said that 10% of the company will be owned by Nature. So there will be mechanics around that, and examples could be building a trust for that 10%, coming up with clear guidelines on how that can be accessed. We definitely want it to go back to communities that are doing nature-based solutions, and also working with the Earth Law Center to put nature as director so that we have nature sitting with us, understanding what's going on in the business and guiding and having a vote. So we're in this early journey, learning how to put that into practice, from our bylaws to our processes and the way that we think about things. But we're saying it out loud, even if we don't have all the answers, because we believe that the conversations need to start now. And the fact that you're asking is a good example. Everyone we talk to, what does that mean? What does that mean, right?
Yeah.
And in reality, it could mean different things for different organizations. And that's the beauty of it.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be what we hope, that we will be part of every journey of those that would want to do it with us and with the Earth Law Center.
Yeah. Well, it seems that you've always been out front and on the edge, whether it was with the sustainability department for Palm Pilots or the supply chains at Microsoft, and now here at Context Nature. So are there any other final messages that you'd like to share, Ephi?
First is that we have to have these discussions now. And it's okay to have different opinions. But then we need to converge on what type of action we can do. One call to action, of course, is to join our ecosystem. If you're a data provider, a service provider, have conversations with us. Let's take a look at what you have. We're going to be working with other partners that are going to be verifying that information. We want to create a marketplace for those individuals and organizations so that they can make that available to decision makers. And if you are an organization, a corporation, small, medium size, or even one of the larger corporations, have a conversation with us too, because we want to understand where you're at in your process so we can define workflows that actually you will use and they're not one-off, that we can embed into how you think about doing your business from strategy all the way to execution. If you're a nonprofit or even government, we definitely are not, I should say an NGO, non-governmental organization or government. We definitely want to have conversations with you. We want to hear your perspectives and see how we can ensure that's part of the data that's surfaced for these organizations. And, we would love to make sure that the voices of the Indigenous communities and those that perhaps will not have voice oftentimes in the boardroom or in corporations and organizations, we would love to figure out how we bring those voices so that we can learn from them and also figure out how we can support projects on the ground. And that way we can really get started. Again, let's just get going.
Yeah, let's get going. Ephi, thank you so much for being with us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity. Thank you, Matt.
Okay, I hope you liked that conversation with Ephi. You can learn more at contextnature.com. For more conversations, check out maearth.com. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next one.